Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
Betty Friedan ended her book, The Feminine Mystique, with the phrase, "A woman has the power to choose." The feminine mystique was a feeling that Betty Friedan and really everyone in the United States was feeling in the 50s and the 60s, that a woman should be satisfied with the two roles of wife and mother. And that should be sufficient for all women. And Betty, when she kept on encountering this, Betty, as then a magazine writer, a graduate of Smith College, was appalled. So she looked into it for 5 years. She did research, and her conclusion to the book was that a woman has the power to choose to do something else if she wanted to. Well, when she went places and talked about her book, it was published in 1963. It was on the New York Times bestseller list. It only fell off because her publisher was totally astounded that it was a bestseller, and they couldn't keep up with the demand. And so when the books weren't available in the bookstores, naturally the sales fell off, and then the books came back and it went back up. She sold 3 million copies in the first 3 years. And when she was making presentations, people would come up to her, just like you were saying, people came up after you tell stories and tell stories, people would come up to her and say over and over again, "Your book changed my life. I thought I was the only one who felt out of place." Now, her personal life then, well, it had been totally transformed by the book. She was a wife and a mother. She and her husband had 3 children. Her husband was a stage manager and so didn't have a steady job. And Betty, who had been brought up rather conventionally, always felt uncomfortable when she was making more money than her husband. Well, once her book was published, she was making a tremendous amount of money. In fact, they had enough money to buy an apartment in the Dakota Building on Central Park West in New York City. The Dakota Building where John Lennon lived and lots of other celebrities live. And they bought a summer home on Fire Island, which is off of Long Island. So it looked like this was wonderful. But that was only the public side of her life. The private side, her husband started beating her up. Another feminist activist, a friend of hers, later wrote, "It was common knowledge that if you were appearing with Betty Friedan on TV in those days, you had to show up early to help her with her makeup to hide her black eyes." At least once, her husband tried to push her out of a moving car. Luckily, a friend was driving by and saw what was going on and got it stopped and got Betty into his car, the friend's car, and drove her off. This friend happened to be a divorce lawyer and said, "Betty, when are you going to get a divorce? A divorce will stop all this." And she said, "I can't get a divorce. Smith graduates don't get divorced. I don't know anyone who's divorced." "Betty, you could have been killed." "I can't get a divorce." Betty stayed with her husband for 6 years after he started beating her up. I felt so sorry when I read that in her memoir, My Life So Far, that Betty could do so much for women in general and had a hard time fighting for herself. She decided after 6 years to finally divorce her husband because she was afraid the scar tissue around her eyes was going to become permanent. Some choices are hard to make.
I figured I'd come today with the idea of telling a story that really was me, a story the way I tell stories, no matter what. And the haunted house seems to be the perfect one. It's supposed to be, according to Richard Chase in his notes that he looked, the oldest story, haunted house story in America. It's like one of the first ones that probably came over from Europe, and was changed in different ways and made into a real, genuine American story. So I'll tell that for you now. Because not only is it the first haunted house story in America, it's the first one I ever told. One time there was a preacher, and he wanted to see if he could banish a ghost from a house in his settlement. This house had been haunted about 10 years, and several people tried to stay there all night because, you know, if you stay all night in a haunted house, it gets rid of that haunting spirit. Well, several people, man, woman, children, families, had tried, but all had been scared out by the ghost around midnight. Well, this preacher was a brave man. He said, yes, I'll do it. And he went on up to that house with his Bible in his hand. He went on in. And you can picture what that haunted house looked like. It was gray, and the windows were broken out, and the door was off the hinges. And actually, when he pushed the door open, it was colder inside than it was outside. But he went in anyway, and he saw a huge fireplace, and there was some kindling and some newspapers, and he had some matches, and so he built himself a fire, found a big log. And pretty soon he had this big fire going in the fireplace, and he moved a chair close to it. And he opened up his Bible, and he started to read. He didn't have any trouble at all, just reading his Bible until just before midnight, when he heard something in the cellar, going back and forth and back and forth. And then there's something started to scream and get choked off, and there's a lot of thrashing around and struggling. And finally, everything got quiet again. Well, I told you this preacher was a brave man. Anybody else would be out of that house in 2 seconds flat. But he sat right back down, he opened up his Bible, and he started to read again. But he didn't get more than 2 sentences read before he heard that thing starting up the cellar stairs. Step, 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 till it was right outside the cellar door. Well, then that preacher, he did get scared, and he stood up, and he held his Bible out in front of him. The knob turned slowly, and the door opened wide. And that preacher, he said in a quiet voice, "Who are you? What is it you want?" Well, the ghost came right across the room, straight up to him, took hold of his coat lapels. It turned out to be a young woman about 20 years old. She smelled earthy. Her hair was torn and tangled, and the flesh was dropping off her face so he could see bones and part of her teeth. She didn't have no eyeballs, but there was a kind of a blue light way back in her eye sockets. And she had no nose to her face. Well, then she started talking. It sounded like her voice was coming and going with the wind blowing through it. Told him how her friend had killed her for her money and buried her in the cellar. Said if he'd dig up her bones and give her a Christian burial, she could rest. But then she told him not to bury all the bones. She told him to keep the end joint of the little finger of the left hand, just this little piece of bone right here. When he found it, he was to hold on to it till the next church meeting and put it in the collection plate. And if anybody touched that finger bone who was guilty of the murder, you'd find out. And if you come back here once more, after that, you'll hear my voice at midnight, and I'll tell you where my money is hid, and you can give it to the church. And the ghost sobbed like it was tired and sank right down through the cellar floor. What else could that preacher do? He was terrified by this time, but he knew he had to obey the ghost. He had to do what the ghost told him to do. And so he found an oil lamp with a little bit of oil left in it, and he lit it by the flame from the fireplace. And he held it out just like this. And he started walking down the stairs, down those dark stairs, lighting only just a little patch as he went. And when he got down, he looked around and he saw bones flung all over the cellar. They were in every corner, and it took him all night, all the rest of the night, to gather up all those bones. It was dawn when he came up those stairs with those bones. And he took them right to the cemetery by the church, and he dug the grave himself. And he put her in the grave, and he prayed over her bones and her grave. But he didn't bury all the bones. He kept the end joint of the little finger, the left hand, just this piece. It took him a long time to find it, but when he did, he held on to it until the next church meeting. And that Sunday, when no one was looking, he put that finger bone in the church collection. And then he went out as usual to give his sermon, and they sang their song, and he sat back. And he looked at everybody in the church. And the collection plate was being passed up and down the aisles. He looked at each person who put his hand in that collection plate. And sure enough, when a certain man put his hand in that collection plate and touched that finger bone, it stuck to his hand. He rubbed and scraped and tore at that bone trying to get it off. He went to screaming like he was going crazy. And then they dragged him up to the front of the church right before the preacher. And he confessed the murder. He was taken off and tried and hung with that finger bone still stuck on his hand. It never did come off. But the preacher did go back to that house one midnight. Didn't see the ghost, but the ghost's voice told him to dig under the hearth rock by the fireplace. He did. He found a big sack full of gold and silver money. And he brought it to the church. And nobody ever heard tell of that ghost anymore. But the print of those bony fingers, when a ghost took hold of his coat lapels, was burnt right into the cloth. And that never did come out either. And that's the story of the haunted house.
Let's go.
Kwai ni domba.
Hello, my friend.
Kwai ni domba.
Hello, my friend.
Ni domba.
My friend,
Pakunongazian.
you appear new to me.
Kwai ni domba.
Hello, my friend.
Kwai ni domba.
Hello, my friend.
In namito kasizuk.
I see your face.
Nuli da honzi.
I am happy.
Pomosa an spiwi ni anekwombi.
Will you walk with me now,
Ni domba.
my friend?
Alosada.
Yes, let us go.
Adozigao zi namito.
There is much to see.
Wazonli kizi songabasop.
The snow is gone.
Mskiko askaskuigen.
The grass is green.
Nikwombi kizos tsiga tsigualis lintoak.
It is the moon when the small frogs sing.
Uligen odzi pomosa spiwikia.
It is good to walk with you,
Nidomba.
my friend.
Uligen odzi pomosa.
It is good to walk
Ozomigaki siguan.
because it is spring.